Chapter 1. The moonstone was warm in my hand when I heard Lucan promise to bury me alive. Not in those exact words. Men like Alpha King Lucan Marr never say the ugly thing directly. They dress it in protocol and paperwork and the kind of quiet, reasonable tone that makes cruelty sound like administration. But I heard it. Every syllable. Standing outside the heavy oak door of his private chamber, holding a restored moonstone against my chest and a medical document folded twice in my coat pocket. A document confirming that I was 3 months pregnant with his child. I heard my mate tell Royal Seer Gideon Crow exactly what would happen to me after I gave birth. Confinement beneath the Eastern Abbey. No visitors. No sunlight. Another Omega selected to raise the child inside the palace walls while I stayed sealed in a room where no one would hear me. The mate bond inside my chest should have shattered. That is what every story says happens when betrayal cuts that deep. The golden thread between bonded pairs snaps, and you feel the break like a blade through the sternum. I pressed one hand flat against my ribs and waited for it. The bond stayed warm. Warmer than it had been all week, actually. That warmth was what made me look through the keyhole instead of running immediately. Something was wrong in a way that went beyond heartbreak, and the moonstone had begun vibrating against my palm like a compass needle arguing with itself. Through the keyhole I saw Lucan's back. His broad shoulders, the familiar fall of dark hair against his collar. Gideon Crow stood opposite him, 60 years of patience folded into a thin, composed face, his rings catching the candlelight. The moon-glass mirror mounted on the eastern wall filled the space behind them. An enormous artifact, 8 feet tall, framed in silver blackened iron. Lucan's voice was its usual low register, controlled. Domestic in the way of a man discussing household management rather than the disposal of his pregnant mate. Then I saw the reflection. Crow appeared in the mirror. His face, his rings, the particular slope of his left shoulder. Lucan did not. The mirror showed only Crow standing in an empty room. My lungs stopped cooperating. I stayed absolutely still because moving felt dangerous, the way sudden movement near a sleeping animal feels dangerous. The kind of instinctive freeze that bypasses thought entirely. The figure wearing Lucan's shape continued speaking. Its voice was exact, every cadence, every half-pause Lucan used when he was being deliberate about something. The figure said my unborn child would make it possible to force bonding across every pack territory on the eastern seaboard. No more voluntary mating rituals. No more rejection. Complete obedience, biological and permanent, delivered through the bloodline my body was currently building. The moonstone in my hand went from warm to burning. Ancient script rose through the stone's surface the way heat rises through glass. Letters assembling themselves from nothing, pale gold against white. Not him. Not safe. The figure turned toward the door. Its eyes did not move with its body. The head rotated. The shoulders rotated. But the eyes stayed fixed on Crow, pointed in the wrong direction entirely, like something that had learned to imitate a person's movements without fully understanding what eyes were for. I did not scream. I did not confront the thing wearing my mate's face. I did not make a single sound. I walked, fast and even, the way I had been trained to move through the palace, purposeful, unhurried, the gait of someone running an errand rather than running for their life. I went directly to my artifact restoration workshop 3 corridors away and spent 4 minutes destroying every record that indicated where I worked, where I slept, and what projects I had been assigned. I took my restoration kit. I took the chemical compounds I used for treating corrupted magical surfaces: silver cleaning acid, anti-reflective wax, black oxide powder. I took the moonstone because it was talking to me and I had learned years ago to listen to objects that talked. I left my mating ring on the work table beside the folded medical document. Let him find it. Let whatever was wearing his face find it and understand what the absence of that ring meant. The palace had been built over colonial-era tunnels connecting the cliff foundations to the shore. I knew this because restoring the palace's historical artifacts had required me to study its architecture down to the subterranean level. No one else in the building knew those passages the way I did. Not the guards. Not Crow. Not whatever stood in that mirrored chamber pretending to have eyes. I found the tunnel entrance behind a false wall in the east cellar and dropped into the dark without hesitation. Stone closed around me. The air turned cold and salt-edged and very old. My footsteps echoed wrong. Too many of them, a fraction of a second off, like the tunnel itself was learning to mimic my gait. I told myself it was acoustics. The moonstone pulsed twice. Then it went completely silent in a way that felt less like quiet and more like held breath. Behind me, from the direction of the chamber I had just left, came a sound that moved through stone the way sound is not supposed to move. Something was scratching the inside of the mirror. Chapter 2. The tunnel breathed. That is the only way I can describe it. A slow, rhythmic pressure against my eardrums, like standing inside a chest cavity, like the stone walls around me were expanding and contracting in a cycle too long and too deep to be called breathing by any biological standard, but felt exactly like it anyway. I moved through the dark with one hand on the wall and my restoration kit slung across my back, counting my steps the way my training had taught me to count anything that mattered, because numbers are honest when everything else is pretending. The moonstone had gone cold. Not room temperature cold. The kind of cold that meant the stone was working. Pulling something in, processing it, the same thermal drop I felt when a corrupted artifact was actively consuming energy from its environment. I kept it pressed against my palm and did not look at it directly because looking at a working stone too long could sync your nervous system to whatever it was processing, and I needed my nervous system for myself right now. The first mirror was 12 steps in. An old one, colonial-era iron frame, set into the tunnel wall at shoulder height like someone had bricked it in deliberately. Most of it was black with corrosion. A strip down the center had stayed reflective, and in that strip I saw my own face looking back at me. Tired, pale, 3 months of pregnancy sitting just beneath my skin in the particular way it had started to show. This slight new weight around my jaw and throat that I had been pretending not to notice. I reached into my kit and pulled out the anti-reflective wax. Covered the mirror completely in 45 seconds. It was not the first corrupted reflective surface I had ever neutralized. Every artifact conservator knew the protocol for mirror containment. You treated them like open wounds. You sealed them before anything could move through. My training had always framed that as metaphor. I was no longer treating it as metaphor. The second mirror was a pool. Standing water collected in a natural depression in the tunnel floor, perfectly still despite the sound of the ocean somewhere beyond the rock. Perfectly circular, perfectly black, reflecting the faint bioluminescent lichen on the ceiling with too much accuracy. The reflection was sharper than the source, which is not how reflections work. I stepped around it without touching it and covered the surface with black oxide powder from my kit, which scattered across the water and killed the reflection in seconds. The tunnel forked. Left went deeper into the cliff, toward the sound of waves. Right curved upward at a grade that meant surface access within maybe 400 steps. I had studied these passages from historical survey maps, and right was correct. Right was the route to the Ashwake shoreline. Right was the direction I needed. Something moved in the left corridor. Not a sound exactly, a displacement. The particular quality of darkness shifting, the way air moves differently when mass enters it. I stood absolutely still and stared into the left fork for 3 full seconds. A man stepped into the edge of my vision. Royal livery. One of Lucan's household guards, young, early 20s, with a cut above his eyebrow that was bleeding very little for a wound that looked that fresh. He raised both hands when he saw me, the gesture of someone showing they were unarmed. His voice came out rough and frightened and completely convincing. He said Lucan had been imprisoned. He said the palace was under control of something that had been living inside the mirror system for months. He said he had been trying to find me, that Lucan had sent him to find me, that I needed to come back because Lucan needed me and the situation was worse than I could possibly understand. He knew details, specific ones. The name of the restoration project I had just abandoned. The nickname Lucan used for me in private. I watched his face while he talked. The tunnel was cold. Every time I exhaled, I could see my breath. A faint white cloud that appeared and dissolved in the faint light of the lichen. Normal. Biological. Warm body in cold air. His breath made no cloud. Not once. His chest moved. His lips moved. His voice produced sound. But the air in front of his face stayed perfectly undisturbed. No condensation, no warmth. Like his body was producing exactly the right sounds without producing any heat at all. I reached back into my kit for the silver cleaning acid. He lunged before I had it fully out of the case. Not like a person lunges, no winding up, no weight shift, just a compression, and then he was covering the distance at a speed that belonged to something that did not need to obey momentum. I got the acid out. Threw it not at him but at the large antique mirror mounted on the left wall behind him. The one I had clocked when I first saw the fork. The one with just enough reflective surface left to be a door. The acid hit the mirror. The guard stopped like someone had cut a wire inside him. He stood frozen for 1 full second, face wrong, features arranged in an expression that did not correspond to any emotion I had ever seen on a human face. Then the remaining reflection on the mirror surface darkened, and the creature in the guard's body simply stepped backward into the wall and was gone. I ran. The right tunnel. The upward grade. For 117 steps by my count before the ceiling cracked open and salt air poured in over my face, and I climbed out onto a rocky shoreline with the Atlantic black and enormous in front of me and an abandoned lighthouse at the top of the cliff to my left. The moonstone pulsed once against my palm. Every light in the lighthouse was dark, except one window near the top where something that was not a flame moved behind the glass. Chapter 3. The lighthouse door opened before I reached it. He filled the frame the way a storm fills a sky. Not violently, not suddenly, just completely, until there was no sky left that wasn't storm. Tall, broad across the shoulders, dark coat soaked through with rain, black hair flat against his face and neck. He was holding a lantern in his left hand. The lantern light moved across his jaw, his throat, the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting and was very practiced at not showing it. His scent hit me before he spoke. Dark spruce, salt water, extinguished candles and charged air, the specific electric smell of the moment before lightning decides where it wants to land. My wolf woke up like someone had thrown cold water at her face. Not the slow, gentle pull of a recognized mate. Something more like recognition of a different order, primal and structural, the way a compass needle does not decide to point north but simply does. I pulled the artifact blade from my kit and pressed it against his throat in one motion. He did not step back. He did not reach for me. He looked at the blade, then at my face, with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who was genuinely curious rather than frightened. And that absence of fear was more unsettling than the scent had been. His dominance came up then, not as aggression, not the territorial pressure Lucan used when he wanted a room to know who owned it. This was older, heavier, a frequency that resonated in the tunnel of the spine rather than on the surface of the skin, the kind of dominance that belonged to bloodlines that had been alpha for so many generations the authority had become structural. Every wolf on the shoreline went silent at once. The water sounded louder in the absence. My hand did not shake. He noticed that. Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but adjacent to it. He lifted the lantern slightly so the light fell more clearly across my face, and his eyes moved over me the way a person's eyes move over a document they need to understand before they respond. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was low and even and carried the slight roughness of someone who had been awake for longer than was reasonable. I had not noticed the cut on my forearm from the tunnel wall. I noticed it now. "Move back," I said. He moved back. Exactly as far as the blade would have required him to move, no further, the precise compliance of someone who was choosing to cooperate rather than being compelled to. I stepped inside the lighthouse. The floor was dry stone, old maritime equipment stacked along the walls, an archive of wooden crates and iron-banded trunks that had no business being in an abandoned lighthouse unless the lighthouse was not actually abandoned. The lantern light reached the ceiling and found more crates stacked there on iron shelving, and something in my conservators trained I clocked the age and origin of what I was looking at. Artifacts, carefully stored, some of them old enough that the wood of the crates had grayed in a particular way that meant decades. The floor moved, not an earthquake. A single, precise crack running along the mortar between two stone slabs, the stone itself tilting 3 degrees as something shifted in the cliff below. My foot went wrong and my weight went with it and I was falling sideways before I processed what was happening. He caught me. One arm around my back, the other coming under my arm, not touching the pregnancy, somehow, as though he had known the exact geometry of my body before he touched it, knew what to protect. His dominance swept through me on contact, and something in my body that had nothing to do with the blade or the mission or the cold simply stopped fighting. One child in me responded to him, Not Lucan's warm familiarity, but something different. Something that pulsed toward this man's warmth like it knew him the way it knew home. 2 heartbeats. My hand pressed flat against my stomach. I had felt 1 for 3 months. Now I felt 2. He released me the moment I straightened. Both hands away from my body before I had to tell him. The foundation shifts with the tide, he said. Informational. No apology in it, no attempt to make the contact into something I had not consented to. I raised the blade again. Good, he said. Something moved in the upper window of the lighthouse, the thing I had seen from the shoreline, the movement that was not fire. A mirror wolf came through the glass in a cascade of silver shards, larger than any wolf I had seen, its coat wrong in the way all the copied creatures were wrong, too smooth, too uniform, like something that had seen a wolf once and rebuilt it from memory without access to the original. It hit the floor on all 4 feet and its eyes found me immediately. He was already moving. He hit the creature at an angle that turned its momentum against it, driving it into the wall, and his dominance crashed through the lighthouse like a physical wave, stopping the creature mid-motion. While it was suspended in that half-second of compelled stillness, I saw the anchor, a fragment of reflective material embedded in the creature's chest, the surface through which it was being operated. The chest, I said. Break the surface. He broke it without asking how I knew. The wolf dissolved. Not violently. It simply stopped being coherent, its form loosening from the inside out until there was nothing left but a scatter of silver light on the stone floor. He looked at me across the ruin of the creature. Your name, he said. Run, I told him. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. You can call yourself whatever keeps you alive tonight, Merritt Bellamy. The moonstone cracked down the center in my coat pocket. Then he told me my mother had not died giving birth to me. She had disappeared while investigating the mirror. Chapter 4. He gave me a room with a lock on the inside. That was the first thing I noticed about the town of Ashwake. Not the hand-painted black surfaces where mirrors used to be, not the matte finish metal fixtures on every door and window frame, not the way the residents moved through the streets with the contained efficiency of people who had learned that paranoia was just accurate pattern recognition. The first thing I noticed was that Thorn Ashby gave me a room with a lock on the inside and kept the only key on my side of the door. I did not sleep. I sat at the edge of the narrow bed with my kit open across my knees and inventoried every chemical compound I had left. Because taking stock of what you have is the first competent thing you can do after your life collapses. Anti-reflective wax, 3/4 of a jar. Black oxide powder, 1 container. Silver cleaning acid, 2 vials. Moonstone in 2 pieces, both still vibrating at a frequency too low for ears, something I felt in my back teeth. In the morning, a woman left breakfast outside the door without knocking. Thorn himself appeared an hour later. He did not try the door. He stood in the corridor and spoke through the wood. The archive is open. I won't be in it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened the door. The archive was housed in the lighthouse's lower 2 floors. A library of bound records, sealed artifact cases, and what I recognized immediately as a significant collection of forbidden bond documentation, the kind that the Atlantic Council had been claiming did not exist for 30 years. Shelves built from salvaged ship timber. Lanterns with blackened glass. No reflection surface anywhere in the room. The sea outside was audible through the walls, a constant low register that made the silence inside feel inhabited rather than empty. Thorn was not there as promised. I started with the oldest records because that is where the architecture of any conspiracy lives. Not in the recent documentation where people are already being careful, but in the early material from before anyone understood how large the thing was going to become. Within 4 hours, I found the first reference to Mirror Kings. The terminology was clinical, almost bureaucratic, which made it more disturbing than dramatic language would have been. A Mirror King was not a supernatural creature in the traditional sense. It was a constructed one. The process required a moonglass artifact of significant age, an alpha of substantial rank, and a specific type of sustained psychic pressure, years of it, ideally the kind created by keeping a powerful person in a state of chronic moral compromise. Fear about their position. Guilt about the choices they were not making. Desires they refused to acknowledge. The mirror did not invent those things, collected them, and when enough had collected, when the weight of what the alpha was refusing to face became sufficient, The mirror used that mask to construct something operational. A duplicate, precise in every detail of surface presentation. Hollow at the center where character was supposed to be, but capable of executing every action the original had considered and stopped short of taking. My hands were very still on the page. The duplicate could not create new cruelties. It could only manifest the ones already present. The thoughts Lucan had entertained and set aside, the decisions he had approached and retreated from, the words he had almost said. Which meant what I had heard through the keyhole was real. Not in the sense that Lucan had spoken it. In the sense that Lucan had thought it, at some point, clearly enough that a mirror could build a mouth to say it for him. I was still processing that when Thorn appeared in the archive doorway. He had been outside with the tide surveys, judging by the damp hem of his coat. He looked at whatever was on my face and did not ask about it. "There are guards on the east path," he said. "I've assigned two to remove them," I said. A pause. Brief, controlled. "You're carrying. Remove them," I said again. "Or I leave through the west dock tonight with what I've already read." He looked at me for 3 seconds with an expression that was working very hard at neutral. Then he turned and walked back through the door, and I heard him speak to someone in the corridor in a tone that was quiet and final. When he returned, he said a lighthouse key, an envelope of emergency currency, and a hand-drawn map with the unmonitored boat circled in the harbor on the work table beside me. He set them there and stepped back and did not say anything about what the gesture meant, which meant he understood exactly what it meant. That giving me the means to leave was the only argument worth making to a person who had just had all their exits taken away. I pulled the map toward me. He sat in the chair across the room and opened a record of his own. We worked in silence for 2 hours. Somewhere in the first hour I realized I had stopped tracking where he was in the room, which was significant because I had been tracking every person in every room for 3 months. Sometime after dark, I found my mother's handwriting in a sealed survey document dated 4 years before my birth. Her name was not attached to it. I recognized the particular slant of her letters because she had taught me to read using her own hand-copied texts. She had worked in this archive, under a name I had never heard her use. Thorn was watching me from across the room. He had been watching me for some time. "How long did you know?" I said. "Which part?" he said. Not a question. Outside, across the sealed harbor, a wolf howled in a register that belonged to the Royal Marr pack. Then another. The third. Getting closer in the interval between them, triangulating, working a grid. Someone had found Ashwake. Chapter 5. The ledgers were stored in a subchamber beneath the abbey's east crypt, sealed behind a door that had been welded shut from the outside and then covered with false stonework. The kind of concealment that was not meant to be temporary. Whoever had sealed this room had believed it was never going to be opened again. Thorn cut through the weld in the dark with tools from the lighthouse's mechanical store. I held the ultraviolet lamp. Neither of us spoke for the 40 minutes it took because we had agreed before leaving Ashwake that silence inside the abbey grounds was not caution. It was survival, and the distinction mattered. The door swung inward on hinges that had no business being that quiet for a welded seal. The room was cold in the specific way of spaces that have been airtight for years, a preserved cold, the cold of stop time. Wooden shelving along 3 walls. Document boxes stacked with the organizational precision of someone who had expected to need these records again and wanted them findable. A table in the center with a single lantern mount, no lantern. I set up the ultraviolet lamp on the table and started pulling boxes. The first 3 were administrative. Procurement records for the abbey's general operations, correspondence about property boundaries, maintenance requests. Normal. The kind of material that might legitimately be sealed if the abbey had closed down without a formal archiving process. The 4th box was not normal. Medical ledgers. 37 of them, uniform in size, bound in the same pale gray material. Dated across a span of 22 years. I opened the first one and the entries were structured like clinical trials, subject identifier, bond status before intervention, method applied, bond status after, observed behavioral compliance rating, notation on any resistance events and how they were resolved. The word resolved appeared frequently. I opened a second ledger. The third. The pattern was consistent, hundreds of subjects, every one of them listed with the bond status marker for omega, every one of them in the intervention records without any documentation of consent or voluntary participation. The methods column used clinical language for things that were not clinical. The compliance ratings rose over the course of each subject's record, and the resistance notation column got shorter, and then eventually stopped having entries, which I understood after the fourth ledger meant the resistance had been fully eliminated rather than that the subjects had agreed. Thorn was reading over my shoulder. I felt his jaw tighten before I saw it. "How long has Crow been running this?" I said. "The earliest ledger I can find is dated 22 years ago," Thorn said. "But the methodology in the first volume is too refined for a beginning." He had been working toward this for longer than these records show. I pulled the box nearest the back wall. The ledger on top was older than the others, the binding darker with age, the entries in a different hand. Not Crow's precise administrative script, but something looser, more urgent, the handwriting of someone writing under pressure. I opened it to the middle. Lucan's signature was on the legislative authorization page. Not a stamp, not a proxy notation. His signature, the one I had watched him sign documents with for 3 years, the particular extension of the final letter that he made when he was being deliberate about something. "That could be forged," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of how steady my voice was. Thorn reached past me and opened the back cover of the ledger. Pressed into the inside backboard was a wax seal. Not a signature seal, a scent seal, the kind used for legal authentication in pack law because scent could not be forged the way signatures could. The wax was old, but the impression was intact and the scent embedded in it, even across years of sealed storage, was winter roses and frozen pine. Lucan's scent. His exact scent. The one I had fallen asleep breathing for 3 years. My hands set the ledger down very carefully on the table. Thorn did not say anything. He gave me the space to sit with it, which was worse than if he had spoken because it meant the evidence was conclusive enough that there was nothing useful to add. Lucan had not built this system. The record timeline made that clear. The experiments had begun before Lucan's rule. But Lucan had signed the legislation that funded Crow's continued operations. He had known what the funding was for. He had chosen to let it continue, and the authorization pages showed he had renewed that legislation twice. Water flooded the crypt suddenly. Not a flood, a controlled seep, the kind that meant the water table beneath the abbey had been pressurized, and something moving through the subterranean tunnel network was displacing it. Mirror creatures used water the same way they use standing pools, but they needed volume, enough surface area to transit a full-sized body. 3 of them came through the flooded floor simultaneously. The fight was close and brutal and specific in the way that fights in enclosed stone rooms are specific. No room for distance, every movement a negotiation with the walls and the shelving and each other. I identified anchor surfaces and called their locations. Thorn destroyed them. We worked in the same efficient shorthand as the lighthouse, his physicality and my knowledge operating as a single system. The third creature caught him across the ribs before it dissolved. Not deep, but he went down on one knee against the shelving and stayed there for a moment longer than someone without a significant injury would have needed. I pulled medical supplies from the kit I never moved without, cut away the outer layer of his coat and treated the wound with clean hands and efficient pressure. He was very still while I worked, the way large, dominant people are still when they understand that stillness is the most useful thing they can offer. His skin was warm under my hands. His scent rose under the blood, spruce and salt water, and something I had not identified before, something underneath the primary notes, dark and complicated and familiar in a way that made no sense. When I looked up, he was watching my face. I found the prophecy document in the last box while he was still watching me. His name was in it. My name was in it. And a bloodline notation beside the second child's record that described Thorn Ashby as the designated sole father of an heir destined to carry the Ashby crest. He had known. Before the lighthouse. Before the storm. He had known exactly who I was and what I was carrying before I ever pressed a blade against his throat. The water was still rising around our feet. Chapter 6. The water was still rising around our feet when Thorn said, "I knew before the lighthouse. I need you to know that I know that you know." I did not look up from the prophecy document. The words on the page were not moving, but my understanding of them was shifting and reconfiguring the way a sentence changes meaning when you discover the author knew the ending before they wrote the first word. Thorn had been stationed at that lighthouse. Thorn had opened that door before I knocked. Thorn had caught me when the floor moved with the specific geometry of someone who knew exactly what he was protecting. I rolled the document and put it in my kit. "Then we are done here," I said. He stood. The wound across his ribs had stopped bleeding through the bandage I had applied, and he moved without favoring it, which told me his pain threshold was either very high or he was running on something stronger than adrenaline. We left the crypt through the same entrance we had cut open, pulling the door as close to sealed as it would go behind us, and moved through the abbey grounds in the dark without speaking. Back in Ashwake. Back in the lighthouse archive. The harbor outside was black and quiet, the earlier wolf howls gone, which did not mean the Marr pack scouts were gone. It meant they had found what they were looking for and stopped announcing themselves. I packed my kit with the systematic focus of someone who had already decided to leave. "You had every exit available to you," Thorn said from the doorway. "The boat is still in the harbor. The map is still in your coat. I have not moved a single thing." "I know," I said. "Then why are you still here?" I stopped packing. The moonstone pieces in my inner pocket had been warming for the last hour, a steady rise in temperature that had nothing to do with the environment and everything to do with proximity. To him, I understood now, to the specific resonance of his bloodline against the second heartbeat I was still learning to acknowledge as real. The second child. The one who pulsed toward Thorn the way a compass needle did not decide but simply oriented. "Because I want to trust you," I said to the kit and not to him. "And wanting to trust you after everything I just found out about men who knew things about me that I didn't know about myself. That terrifies me more than the mirror creatures. More than Crow. More than whatever is wearing Lucan's face in that palace." He was quiet long enough that I turned around. He was not in the doorway anymore. He had moved into the room, close enough that his scent reached me clearly. Spruce, salt water, extinguished candles. And his face in the lantern light was doing something I had not seen it do before. The careful control was still present, but something was working underneath it, something that the control was struggling to keep at the surface level where it was manageable. "I have wanted you since the moment you put that blade against my throat," he said. "Not because of the prophecy. The prophecy told me you existed. It did not tell me what it would feel like to watch you neutralize a corrupted mirror surface in the dark, and then read an archive record that would have broken most people and simply set it down and keep working." The moonstone went still in my pocket. Both pieces simultaneously. The first time they had been fully quiet since I left the palace. I closed the distance between us. The first contact was my hand against his jaw. Not the blade this time, just my hand, learning the geography of a face I had been refusing to look at directly. He did not move. He did not reach for me. He waited with the same patience he had shown from the first moment, the patience of a man who understood that waiting was not passivity. It was respect made visible. I kissed him. It began as a question I did not have language for. His response was careful, measured, the same restraint he applied to every other form of his power. Then I made a sound against his mouth that I had not planned, something honest and exhausted and real, and the restraint broke like a seal releasing pressure. His hands came up to my face, both of them, palms against my jaw, thumbs at my cheekbones, holding me like I was something that mattered beyond function or prophecy or political utility. The kiss deepened and his scent surrounded me completely, and for the first time since the keyhole, since the mirror, since the cold tunnel and the creature with the wrong eyes, I felt my body stop bracing for impact. Then the archive mirror, the one we had painted black on day one, exploded outward from the inside. Lucan fell through it bleeding onto the stone floor and said, "The thing wearing my face knows about the kiss." Chapter 7. Lucan's blood was real. I had studied enough biology to know the difference between blood produced by a body and blood produced by a mirror construct, temperature, viscosity, the way it moved on a surface. What was spreading across the archive floor was warm and dark and moved with the slow weight of something that had come from inside a living person. I crouched beside him before I had processed the decision to move. His injuries were not decorative. 3 deep lacerations across his left forearm in a pattern consistent with mirror glass edges, a bruised orbital ridge, the particular pallor of someone who had been held without food or adequate temperature for an extended period. His scent was faint beneath the blood and the mirror residue. Winter roses, frozen pine, muted, like a fire burning low on bad fuel. I pressed cloth against the worst laceration. Thorn had not moved from where he stood when the mirror exploded. His dominance was up and controlled, filling the room at a register that was not aggressive but was very clear about what would happen if Lucan made a wrong move. Lucan looked at Thorn once and then looked away, which told me he understood the situation well enough to choose his battles. "The duplicate replaced me the night before you heard it in my chamber," Lucan said. His voice was rougher than I had ever heard it. "It kept me inside the mirror system. I could see through the surface, but I couldn't break through. The construct was drawing power from my bond to maintain its density. Every time I weakened, it pulled more from the connection between us. I kept pressure on the laceration. Your signature is on the legislative authorization for Crow's research program," I said. "The one that funded 22 years of forced bonding experiments on Omegas who did not consent." Lucan's jaw tightened. "Yes, that signature predates the duplicate by years." "Yes." The single syllable sat in the room and did not offer anything else, and I respected that more than I would have respected an excuse. I had spent 3 years watching Lucan construct justifications for institutional decisions. The absence of one now was the most honest thing he had given me in recent memory. "I told myself it was a transitional measure," he said finally, "that I would end the program once the political situation stabilized. I kept moving the threshold for when stabilized would actually mean stabilized." He looked at his own hands. "The program was already running when I inherited the crown. I chose to fund it rather than dismantle it because dismantling it would have cost me alliances I thought I needed. And the Omegas in those ledgers paid the cost of my alliances," he said. "Yes, I know what that is." Thorn moved then, not toward Lucan but toward the archive door, checking the corridor. The mirror that Lucan had come through was fully destroyed. No surface remaining, no transit point. But Crow had eyes in more places than one mirror. "The thing wearing my face knows your location now," Lucan said. "It felt the connection break when I came through. It will have reported to Crow within minutes." Thorn and Lucan looked at each other across the room. I stood up. "Neither of you claims me," I said. Both of them looked at me. "Neither of you makes decisions about my children without me present. Neither of you conceals information relevant to my safety or my situation on the grounds that you were protecting me, because protection that requires my ignorance is just control with better manners. And both of you help me take Crow down. Those are the terms." Lucan said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once, the precise nod of a man accepting conditions he had no right to argue with. Thorn was already nodding before I finished. Then the church bells across Ashwake began ringing. Every bell simultaneously, no rhythm, no signal sequence, just a wall of sound that hit the archive windows and kept going, and beneath the sound something changed in the air, a pressure shift that I felt in my chest and then felt in both children at once, a compression like something was pulling at the bond architecture inside my body from the outside. Omegas in the streets began screaming. Thorn's hand found my arm. Not gripping, just contact, grounding. His face had gone to stone. "Crow activated the pulse," he said. "The bells are the transmitter." Through the archive window, I watched 3 bonded Omegas drop to their knees on the harbor road, hands pressed to their own chests, their bodies going rigid with the specific locked stillness of someone receiving a command they could not refuse. Lucan stood behind me. "He's not waiting for the temple," he said. "He's starting the forced bonding network now." Chapter 8. I ran the frequency calculation in my head while Thorn was already moving toward the lighthouse lens housing. The bells were not just sound. Sound at that volume in a coastal settlement would carry 3 miles before the ocean absorbed it, which was not enough to affect the packed territories inland. What Crow had built was a resonance system. The bells created the initial frequency. The salt water in the harbor amplified and conducted it through the groundwater network beneath the coastal settlements, and the moonglass fragments embedded in the foundation stones of every building Crow's teams had accessed over the past decade acted as repeaters, carrying the signal inward to wherever bonded pairs were in proximity to the Earth. The lighthouse lens was the master repeater, the largest glass surface in Ashwake. The one Crow's people had almost certainly treated when the lighthouse was supposedly abandoned. I was at the lens housing door before Thorn reached it. "I need 20 seconds with the oxide powder and 2 minutes with the wax," I said. "Cover the door." He covered the door. I worked. The lens was enormous up close, 6 feet of precision-cut glass, Fresnel style, mounted on a rotating mechanism that distributed light in all directions. The resonance frequency had already been cut into the glass surface in a pattern too fine to see without the ultraviolet lamp, thousands of microscopic channels directing the signal amplification. Standard mirror containment protocol would not touch it. The channels were not reflective surfaces, they were acoustic structures, more like the inside of an instrument than a mirror. I switched methods. Used the oxide powder to disrupt the channel geometry, packed the fine grooves with enough density to break the harmonic pattern, then sealed the surface with 3 layers of wax so the channels could not be recut remotely. The bells outside went from full ring to a broken, stuttering clang, and then stopped. In the street below, the 3 omegas I had watched go rigid slowly straightened. One of them sat on the cobblestones for a long moment before standing. The compression in my own chest released by degrees, like a fist unclenching. Thorn was beside me when I finished. The wound across his ribs was bleeding through the bandage again from the effort of holding the door, and I redid the dressing without being asked while Lucan watched from across the lens room with the expression of a man cataloging everything he had forfeited. The moonstone pieces in my kit began resonating against each other. Not the warning vibration. Something different. A harmonic like 2 tuning forks responding to the same note, and out of that resonance came a sound I had not heard since childhood. A voice I had heard every day for the first 8 years of my life, reading to me, teaching me to name the artifacts on her workroom shelves, explaining what it meant that certain objects chose certain people and not others. My mother's voice, coming out of a broken moonstone in a lighthouse on the Maine coast, 27 years after she was supposed to have died. "The child you think you understand," the voice said, "is not the one who needs protecting." Thorn went very still. I picked up both stone fragments and held them together. The voice strengthened. "Crow put me in the artifact network the year before you were born. I have been in every stone in his collection that passed through his hands, including the one he gave Lucan as a diplomatic gift. Including the one Lucan gave you. The moonstone I had been carrying since before I left the palace. The one that had been warming in my hands for 3 months. I have watched everything he planned through the surface of every object he touched." "Merritt." Her voice tightened. "He did not hide your second child from you to protect the prophecy. He hid the second child because that child is the one who can sever every forced bond he has ever created simultaneously. Not the first child. Not Lucan's heir. Yours and Thorn's. That child is the reason he needs you inside the temple. Not to use the child. To prevent the child from ever being used against him." Lucan said, from across the room, "He's going to try to take the child before it's born." I looked at Thorn. Thorn looked at the door. We had 20 minutes before Crow's next move if the bell failure had triggered his contingency, which it had, which I knew because a mirror fragment in the corner of the lens room that I had not yet treated began to glow from the inside, and through its surface I could see, very clearly, Crow's face looking back at me. He was smiling. "The temple," he said through the glass. "Or I take the town apart stone by stone until I find what I need." Chapter 9. The submerged temple entrance was a flooded staircase cut into the cliff base, accessible only at low tide for a window of 22 minutes. We had 19 by the time we reached it. Lucan went first because the water was chest-deep and cold, and he was the one who knew the interior layout from the Royal Survey maps he had personally commissioned and then locked in the Crown Archive 3 years ago, which he admitted without prompting while we were waiting in, the way a man admits things when the time for managing his image has conclusively passed. Thorn stayed at my back, one hand a constant warm pressure between my shoulder blades. Not steering, not controlling, just present, the way a person stays present when they understand that presence is the only thing still in their power to give. The temple interior was dry. High vaulted ceiling of natural rock, ancient pack carvings on every wall, a circular floor plan with the original moon mirror mounted at the far end, or what remained of it. Crow had been working. The mirror frame was surrounded by a rebuilt structure of secondary glass panels, all of them connected with hand-soldered silver wire in a pattern I recognized from the ledger diagrams in the abbey crypt. A bonding amplifier. Not the lighthouse's acoustic system. Something older, biological, designed to use the resonance of an existing mate bond as a transmission carrier. Crow stood in the center of it. Lucan, to my left, stopped walking. Beside Crow stood the duplicate. Lucan's face, Lucan's shoulders, Lucan's hands. And in one of those hands, the moonglass shard I had last seen in Lucan's possession before he disappeared from the archive. He had not been taken. He had left. The message written in his own blood said, "I am taking it to Crow." That was true. What I had read as warning and devastation had been a statement of plan. "It was the only way to get the shard inside the frame array," Lucan said quietly. Crow's wards rejected foreign objects. They wouldn't reject something his own construct carried in. Crow looked at Lucan with the particular disappointment of a man whose prediction of human behavior has proven accurate. "It doesn't matter," Crow said. "The shard is inside the frame. The array is complete. And you have saved me the effort of retrieving you separately." He looked at me. "You are the mechanism, Merritt. Not a participant. Not a decision-maker. A biological key that I have spent 27 years manufacturing patience to use. Choose which alpha bloodline carries forward through the bonding array, and I will release the town." My mother's voice in my memory. "The child you think you understand is not the one who needs protecting. You need me conscious and willing for the array to work," I said. Crow smiled. "The willing part is negotiable." The duplicate moved. It moved toward me with the specific targeting of something that had been given a single instruction and no competing priorities, and Thorn met it in the space between us with a collision that shook the temple floor. The duplicate was stronger than a person. It had no pain response, no fatigue, no self-preservation instinct competing with the directive. Thorn held it. Barely and with everything he had, but he held it. Lucan crossed to the mirror frame in 8 steps, reached into the assembled array, and turned the shard he had carried in. Not inserting it but reversing it, flipping its orientation inside the channel Crow's construction had made for it. Crow moved toward Lucan immediately. I moved first. I placed both moonstone fragments against the surface of the original moon mirror, the master glass, the one everything else was wired to, the one my mother had been embedded in since before I was born. The stones resonated against the surface. The mirror resonated back. And I understood then, with the full clarity of every year of artifact training and every month of carrying a second child who pulsed toward truth the way a compass pulsed toward north, that what my mother had given me was not a warning. It was a tool. I drove both fragments into the mirror surface and the glass did not shatter outward. It collapsed inward, and the entire stored energy of 22 years of forced bond magic, every compulsory connection Crow had built, every stolen consent and overwritten will in his network, all of it reversed direction simultaneously and flowed into me and then out again, and every bonded pair in the temple felt their chains dissolve at once. The duplicate came apart mid-motion. Thorn stepped back from where it had been, breathing hard, one hand braced on his knee. Crow's voice came from somewhere in the collapsing mirror network, no longer through a specific surface, distributed, thinning. "You cannot judge what you were created to serve," he said. "I was not created to serve," I said. "I was created to judge." The temple went completely silent. Then the silver light started. Chapter 10. It did not hurt. That was the first thing I registered, that something was moving through my body with enough force to drop every alpha in the temple to their knees, including Thorn, including Lucan, including the 4 council representatives who had come through the tide entrance behind us believing they were here to witness Crow's completion of his life's work, and none of it hurt. The light spread from the center of my chest outward, following the exact map of every scar I carried, filling them the way water fills a channel cut in stone, purposeful and unhurried and completely indifferent to whether anyone in the room was ready for it. I was the last one standing. That had never been the prophecy's promise for either alpha bloodline. The documents Crow had falsified for decades described an Omega who would produce the deciding heir. The original text, the version my mother had memorized and spoken into the Moonstone network years before I was born, described an Omega who would decide. The distinction had cost 22 years of other people's freedom. Lucan looked up at me from the temple floor with Lucan's real eyes, not the duplicates, not the carefully managed eyes of a king performing steadiness. Just a man on his knees in a wet temple looking at someone he had failed in ways that a long life of correct subsequent choices would not fully repair. "I am not taking you back," I said. "Not cruelly. Plainly." "I know," he said. "You will testify to the council about the authorization records. You will abdicate and fund the survivor recovery through the crown holdings. You will live under ordinary law, the same law the Omegas in those ledgers lived under, with no pack authority and no diplomatic protection." "Yes," he said. He did not ask for my forgiveness, and I respected that more than anything else he had done in the temple. Forgiveness was not the transaction he was owed. Accountability was, and he met it without negotiating the terms. Thorn rose slowly from his knee. He was still bleeding through the dressing on his ribs. His coat was destroyed. His face had the particular exhausted honesty of a person who has used every reserve they had and is now operating on the bedrock of character underneath. He crossed the temple floor and stood in front of me and did not perform anything. No alpha stance, no dominance display. "I kept the prophecy from you," he said. "I told myself it was protection. It was control with a cleaner rationale, and I knew the difference and made the choice anyway, and I will spend whatever time you allow me to spend near you making that a different kind of permanent record than the one Crow kept." "I know," I said. I reached up and put my hand against his jaw. The same way I had in the archive. Learning the geography again, this time without the weight of everything unsaid between us. He leaned into my hand. The mating ceremony, 3 days later on the cliff above the temple, was attended by every pack leader whose Omegas had been in Crow's network and who had chosen to come not out of political obligation but because they needed to see with their own eyes that the bonding array was gone and the registry was open and the names in those ledgers were being read aloud by a council archivist into a public record. Thorn approached me with the traditional marking blade. The moon goddess moved before he could use it. Silver light, the same that had filled the temple, spread across my chest and formed a shape around my scars that no royal tradition had a name for because nothing in royal tradition had anticipated it. Every alpha present felt the pressure of it simultaneously, the instruction not to kneel in ceremony but to stand accountable, which was heavier. Thorn put the blade down. We made our vows in words we chose ourselves, without hierarchy, without ritual ownership. The bond that formed between us was the color of storm-charged air and smelled like jasmine and salt water and the specific warmth of a choice made freely in full knowledge of the cost. Beneath my hand, the first child moved. Then the second, the one who pulsed with Thorn's frequency, the one Crow had spent his career trying to prevent. The temple below the cliff trembled. Once, the third heartbeat, the one that had answered from beneath the floor at the moment of Crow's defeat, sounded again. Not from my body, not from Thorn, from the sealed doors in the ocean floor below the cliff, doors that the silver light had apparently been unlocking since the moment I shattered the mirror. Something knocked from the other side. One knock, deliberate, patient, the knock of something that had been waiting a very long time and understood that time, for it was not a problem. Thorn's hand found mine. The doors did not open, but they would. Fate does not create love. Respect does. Accountability does. The freedom to leave and the choice to stay, that does. Whatever waited behind those doors would learn that, or it would deal with what I had become. If the story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and someone out there needs to hear that they are not alone.